My parents wouldn't let me in, saying I wasn't needed because I didn't earn money. But when I won a fortune, they hired a lawyer to go after me. Growing up, I was always the odd one out, feeling like I had to carve out a space for myself just to exist. It sounds dramatic, I know, but when you're a kid who doesn't quite fit, it feels like the world is against you. It probably started when my mom, Linda, remarried Jim. Jim wasn't a bad guy, really. He provided, kept to himself, and never crossed any glaring lines. But he made no effort to make me feel like part of his family, and honestly, no one else did either. There were 3 of us kids: my half-brother Chad, Jim's son; Andy, my younger brother from my mom's first marriage, just like me; and then there was me, the one who always felt like an outsider. Chad, of course, was Jim's pride and joy, and it wasn't subtle. I can't recall a time Jim wasn't doting on Chad, bragging about how smart or talented he was while I was left in the background, wondering what I was missing. To be fair, my mom wasn't exactly a saint either. She tended to side with Jim, always eager to keep the peace, even if it meant throwing me under the bus. Over time, I started fading into the background, feeling more like a stranger in my own home. At least I had Andy. Being the youngest, he didn't get the same pressure I did. We'd hang out, play video games, talk about anything and everything just to escape for a while. But even that bond started to fade. As he got older, Andy seemed to figure out that being closer to Chad and aligning with Jim's ideas kept him out of trouble, so he distanced himself. I couldn't blame him. He was just trying to survive, same as I was. One night, I came home late from a friend's place. I was only an hour or so past curfew, and I didn't think it was a big deal. But the moment I walked through the door, there was Jim, sitting in the living room, his face set like he'd been waiting all night to pounce. "Do you think you can just walk in here whenever you feel like it?" he snapped, his voice dripping with contempt. I swallowed hard, trying to stay calm. "I'm sorry. I lost track of time." But he didn't want an apology. He launched into a rant about respect and how I was the problem child in the house. I glanced over at my mom, hoping she'd step in, but she just looked away, clearly uncomfortable, unwilling to say a word. Chad had come out of his room and was leaning against the wall, smirking like he was watching a show. And there was Andy, standing at the top of the stairs, looking torn, but he kept silent too. In that moment, it felt like everyone was against me, like being myself, not fitting into their mold, made me the enemy. And for what? For not being exactly who they wanted me to be. When they finally kicked me out, they barely even looked back. And for years, I struggled, but I built a life for myself. Then, out of nowhere, I inherited $10 million from a distant relative. Suddenly, my phone lit up with messages and calls, all full of warmth and love from people who hadn't wanted me in their lives until there was something to gain. Funny how family works, isn't it? After that night, something shifted in me. I began staying out as much as possible, finding any excuse to avoid being home. I'd stay late at school, pretend to join clubs, or just wander the neighborhood for hours, feeling like anything was better than the hostile atmosphere waiting for me back at the house. My grades started slipping, but I didn't care. Survival became my only motivation, counting down the days until I could finally get out for good. Then, things took an unexpected turn. One afternoon, I overheard my mom talking on the phone in hushed tones. Her voice was tense, and the conversation didn't sound like a casual chat. Curious, I started listening more closely, and what I picked up completely threw me. It turned out my mom had been in contact with my biological dad for years, and she'd never told me. The man I'd assumed was out of the picture had actually been trying to be part of my life. When I confronted her, she acted like I was the one crossing a line. "I did what was best for you," she said, like that was supposed to make everything okay. "Your father isn't the man you think he is." She wouldn't give me any real details, just vague statements about how he had problems and how Jim was a better father figure. But I didn't want a replacement. I wanted the truth. I wanted to understand why she'd kept him from me, why I'd grown up feeling like an outsider in my own family. After that, things between us went from bad to worse. I felt betrayed in a way I couldn't even put into words. Every time I looked at her, I saw someone who'd chosen convenience over my right to know my own father, who'd let me suffer in silence rather than disrupt the life she'd built with Jim. She and Jim never seemed to care how isolated I felt. It was all about appearances, maintaining this image of a happy blended family that was a complete illusion. When I turned 18, I finally got the chance to meet my dad. Mom wasn't thrilled, but legally, she couldn't stop me anymore. Meeting him was surreal. He was nothing like I'd been led to expect. My dad, Brian, had a warmth to him I'd never felt from Jim. He genuinely wanted to know me, to understand my life, my experiences. For the first time, I felt like someone was actually listening to me. I told him everything, even things I'd never dared to say out loud before. It felt like a weight lifting off my chest, finally letting go of everything I'd bottled up. But reconnecting with him came with its own set of issues. When Jim found out, he went ballistic, accusing me of betraying the family. My mom tried to mediate, but it was clear she resented me for stirring things up. Even Andy, who had been my closest ally, started to drift away, siding with Mom and Jim. And Chad, of course, looked smug, as if I'd finally proven I didn't belong. I was alone again, but this time I knew where I stood. Of course, Chad had no sympathy. To him, my relationship with Dad was just more proof that I wasn't loyal to the family, as if I'd ever really been part of it in the first place. Eventually, I made the decision to move in with my dad. It was one of the hardest choices I'd ever made, knowing it would likely sever the last threads of connection I had with my mom and brothers. But I couldn't stay in that house anymore. I needed a fresh start. My dad's place was small, a far cry from the house I'd grown up in, but it felt more like home than anywhere else ever had. For the first time, I felt like I could just be me, no tiptoeing around, no waiting for the next argument or passive-aggressive comment. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. And yet, every so often, I'd wonder if I'd made the right choice. Family is supposed to be forever, right? And I'd essentially walked away from mine. One day, out of the blue, I got a call from Andy. He sounded hesitant, almost like he was unsure if he should even be reaching out. "Hey, Alex," he started, fumbling for words. I wanted to talk. I miss you, man." Hearing him say that hit me hard. I hadn't realized just how much I missed him, too. We talked for hours, sharing memories and laughing about things I'd almost forgotten. It felt good, like a piece of home had been returned to me, but it also reminded me of everything I'd left behind. After that, Andy and I started talking more regularly. He told me about what was going on back home, how Mom and Jim were dealing with my absence, and how Chad seemed even more entitled now that I was gone. Apparently, Jim had even been talking about writing me out of his will, which didn't surprise me. But hearing it still stung. Andy mentioned that Mom wasn't thrilled about the idea, but she wasn't exactly fighting for me either. The more we talked, the more I realized that my choice to leave hadn't just affected me. It had shifted the entire family dynamic in ways I hadn't anticipated. Still, as painful as it was to hear, I knew I couldn't go back. I couldn't return to being the invisible, unwanted son. In the end, I decided to cut ties with everyone, except Andy. We kept our connection a quiet, secret rebellion against the family that had tried so hard to push me out. It wasn't easy, and there were days when I doubted if I'd done the right thing. But I knew, for once, I'd found a place where I belonged, where I could be myself without constantly having to apologize for it. Living with Jim had been like navigating a minefield, every word and every look an opportunity for him to remind me of my place. My stepfather had this knack for picking up on everything he didn't like about me and making sure I knew it. But I was done with that. I'd finally found freedom, and I wasn't going to let anyone take it from me again. Every interest, every habit I had that didn't fit into Jim's vision for his family seemed to bother him, and he never kept those opinions to himself. Instead, he'd drop subtle digs, comments that might sound harmless to an outsider but cut me right to the core. Jim had 2 biological kids with my mom, my half-brother Chad and half-sister Lacey. Chad was only a year younger than me and into sports, always surrounded by friends. Then there was Lacey, around 12, Jim's angel. To Jim, they could do no wrong. One morning, I was sitting alone in the kitchen, eating breakfast. Jim walked in and, without so much as a greeting, started scrutinizing me. "Alex, why do you always look so withdrawn?" he asked, his voice dripping with disdain. "You should take a lesson from Chad. He knows how to carry himself." Right on cue, Chad strolled into the kitchen, practically glowing, as if he'd just won a prize. "Hey, Dad," he said, all smiles. Jim slapped him on the back, beaming with pride, completely ignoring me as if I'd just faded from existence. I glanced over at my mom, hoping she'd say something, anything, to defend me. But she was busy pretending not to notice, staring hard at the newspaper in front of her like it was a portal to another dimension. That was typical for her. She hated confrontation and would rather let Jim walk all over me than risk stirring the pot. I felt the familiar knot of resentment tighten in my chest, but I bit my tongue and went back to my breakfast, swallowing my frustration along with my food. The worst moments were when Jim commented on my interests. I'd always been more of a reader, drawn to art and writing. Those interests were my escape, a world I could retreat to when everything else felt hostile. But to Jim, my hobbies were strange, even suspect. If he ever saw me sketching or writing in my journal, he'd scoff. "You need to be out there doing something productive," he'd say, like anything I valued was just a waste of time. One weekend, I'd been working on a painting I was especially proud of. It was an abstract piece, colors that seemed to dance and shift, capturing how I felt on my best days. I had it propped up in the corner of my room where I could see it when I woke up, a reminder of the parts of myself I cherished. But when Jim walked in that afternoon, he barely glanced at it before shaking his head. "What's that supposed to be?" he asked with a dismissive look. "Art. Well, it's not exactly practical, Alex. Chad's learning about business strategies. That's something with a future. You should focus on that." At that moment, Mom walked by, and I caught her eye, pleading silently for any sign of support. But she just looked away, saying nothing, keeping herself safe from the conflict. In those moments, I felt utterly alone, invisible in my own family. But as much as Jim tried to stamp out my interests and values, I clung to them. They were the only pieces of myself that I felt belonged truly to me, even if my family couldn't, or wouldn't, see their worth. Mom gave me a tight, dismissive smile and went about her business, unwilling to get involved. I felt the sting of humiliation creep up my neck. It didn't matter how hard I tried to fit in or impress them, nothing I did would ever be good enough. Jim had his favorites, and I wasn't one of them. The rejection was constant, so I started spending more time in my room, pouring my frustrations into my art, the one place I didn't feel like a failure. Then there was the time Jim decided to host a big family barbecue. He invited everyone, friends, neighbors, even some of Chad's basketball buddies. As usual, I was roped into helping with the setup, while Chad and his friends lounged around, laughing and goofing off. At one point, Chad and his friends started roughhousing near the grill, and before I knew it, they'd knocked over a platter of freshly cooked burgers I'd just set out. Jim came over to check on the food, took one look at the mess, and immediately turned his fury on me. "Alex, can't you do anything right?" he snapped, his voice sharp and dripping with irritation. "You're supposed to be helping, not causing more problems." I tried to explain that it wasn't my fault, that Chad and his friends had caused the spill, but Jim wasn't interested in listening. He just shook his head and muttered something about responsibility and reliability. And again, Mom was right there, well within earshot, but she said nothing. Instead, she smiled nervously at the guests, pretending everything was fine, as if her own son wasn't being humiliated in front of everyone. In that moment, I realized just how alone I was in that house. As time went on, Jim's contempt for me seemed to grow even more blatant. One evening, after Chad scored high marks on his finals, Jim threw a small celebration in his honor. He presented Chad with a new watch, delivering a big, proud speech about how grateful he was to have a son who valued hard work and dedication. I sat there clapping along half-heartedly, feeling more like an outsider than ever. Jim caught my eye and gave me a smug look, as if he knew exactly how left out I felt, and he was enjoying every second of it. The breaking point came during a family vacation. Jim had rented a lake cabin for a week, calling it a bonding experience. But it quickly became clear that the trip was just another excuse for Jim to show off his perfect family. He and Chad spent the entire time fishing, taking photos together, and playing sports, while I was left to entertain Lacey, though she didn't want my company any more than Jim did. She was Jim's daughter through and through, and if Jim didn't respect me, neither did she. One evening, we were all sitting around the fire pit, trying to unwind. Jim was basking in the glow of his little campfire story about family values, leaning back with Chad beside him, grinning and hanging on his every word. I sat off to the side, watching the embers drift up into the night sky, feeling more invisible than ever. That night by the fire pit, Jim decided to start telling stories about all the things Chad had accomplished, every trophy, every medal, every little win. When he finally got to me, he just shrugged, saying, "And Alex, well, he has his own way of doing things." He chuckled under his breath, and the whole family laughed along with him. I just sat there, feeling the humiliation settle over me like a heavy blanket. Even my mom joined in, throwing me that same strained, apologetic smile I'd come to hate. After that trip, I knew I couldn't keep going like this. I couldn't keep living in a home where I was constantly reminded I was an outsider, where even my own mother couldn't be bothered to stand up for me. I started planning my escape, working part-time jobs, saving every penny, and plotting my exit. It didn't matter where I went, anywhere would be better than this. One night, as I sat alone in my room, Lacey walked in without knocking, a look of disdain fixed on her face. "Why are you always hiding in here?" she sneered. "You're so weird, Alex. No wonder Dad doesn't like you." I could feel anger bubbling up inside me, but I forced myself to stay calm. It wasn't really her fault. She'd been raised to see me as the outsider, the strange one who didn't fit in. But that moment cemented it for me. I wasn't going to let them define me anymore. I wasn't going to keep waiting for Mom to defend me or for Jim to finally accept me. I was done. I didn't belong here, and I was finally okay with that. Leaving home wasn't just a choice, it was a necessity. After graduating high school, I was convinced I had to forge my own path, no matter what that meant. Jim was relentless in his disdain, constantly telling me that moving out would be my first mistake, and that the world outside wasn't as forgiving as I imagined. "You'll come crawling back," he'd say, with a bitter certainty that only fueled my determination to leave. But none of it mattered anymore. I'd saved up enough for my part-time jobs and finally found a small apartment downtown, far enough away to feel like a fresh start but close enough to reach out if I ever needed to, though I vowed not to. So one morning in August, I packed my bags, loaded them into the back of my old car, and left. The drive felt surreal, a mix of excitement and the nagging uncertainty Jim had planted in my mind. The apartment building I arrived at wasn't anything impressive. An old brick structure with creaky stairs and an elevator that looked like it could give out any second. My new apartment was small, just a single room with a tiny kitchen and a view of the neighboring building's fire escape. But it was mine. For the first time, I had a space where I could breathe. There were no expectations, no judgment, and no one hovering over my shoulder, criticizing every choice I made. It wasn't perfect, but it was a clean slate, a chance to build a life on my own terms. My new apartment was tiny. A kitchenette, a narrow bathroom, and a single room with barely enough space to turn around, but to me, it felt like a palace. It was my space, where I had complete control over my life. I didn't have to answer to anyone, and I relished the solitude. My first few weeks there were a whirlwind as I adjusted to everything. I quickly realized I'd taken so many things for granted at home. Laundry, grocery shopping, even setting up utilities were all new, confusing territory. I spent hours trying to figure out a budget, breaking down my expenses on paper. But despite my best efforts, the money I thought would last me for months was nearly gone within a few weeks. The charm of independence began to wear off fast. I was working long hours at a nearby cafe, juggling shifts to scrape by. Most days, I'd leave before sunrise and wouldn't get back until late at night. Exhausted, I'd still lie awake in bed, worrying about how to make rent, whether I could afford groceries. I was barely getting by, but I told myself it was worth it. I was free. Then, just as things started to feel like they might be manageable, everything turned upside down. The first I heard about Jim's declining health was through a text. We hadn't spoken in months. The last time I'd visited him after moving out, I'd gone in hopeful, thinking we could finally have a normal conversation, even if just once. Instead, he'd made it clear that he believed I'd failed by leaving, and we hadn't spoken since. One chilly October evening, my phone buzzed with a message from my younger brother, Chad. It was unusually formal for him. "Alex, Dad's in the hospital. Might be serious. You should come by." I knew if Chad was reaching out, things must have been bad. I arrived at the hospital the next morning, feeling strangely detached as I walked through the sterile hallways. When I got to Jim's room, it felt surreal. He was sitting up in the hospital bed, visibly weaker but still carrying that fierce pride I remembered all too well. Chad was beside him, and my older brother Andy leaned against the wall, giving me a nod but not bothering with a smile. Jim's gaze fixed on me with a mixture of surprise and skepticism. "Didn't think you'd actually show up," he said, his voice rough but unmistakably sharp. "Chad said it was serious," I replied, my voice coming out softer than I intended. "So, here I am." Dad's eyes lingered on me, assessing, as if I were a stranger instead of his own son. "Well, I appreciate that you made an effort," he replied dryly. I couldn't tell if he meant it or if it was just another layer of sarcasm. The next few days were a blur of visits to the hospital, navigating a strange mix of past hurts and present worries. I found myself caught between my sense of duty and the deep wounds that years of distance and resentment had left. Jim was weaker, but the complicated web of our relationship still felt just as tangled as ever. I found myself visiting the hospital regularly, partly out of obligation and partly because Chad and Andy seemed to expect it. They were always by Jim's side, practically working in shifts, fulfilling what they seemed to view as a family duty. Every time I showed up, Chad would just give me a curt nod, and Andy would throw me this look, as if he was trying to figure out why I was even there. One afternoon, I walked into the hospital lobby to find both of them sitting together, looking unusually serious. Andy was typing away on his phone, his face twisted in concentration. I took a seat next to Chad, waiting in the tense silence. Eventually, Chad cleared his throat, glancing over at me. "Listen, Alex, there's something you should know." I looked at him, a bit confused. "What is it?" Chad hesitated before finally saying, "Dad's been working on his will." He glanced over at Andy, who nodded. Given his condition, he wanted to settle things sooner rather than later. My stomach tightened. Dad had never mentioned anything about a will, and I certainly hadn't expected to be part of any inheritance discussion. It was just something that had never crossed my mind. Chad continued, "He's decided to divide his assets between Andy and me." The words hit me harder than I expected. "What about me?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Andy put down his phone, looking at me with that familiar, calculating expression. "Dad doesn't think you'd make the right choices with the money," he said bluntly. "He thinks you'd waste it on whatever it is you're doing with your life." I felt a sharp sting of anger, but I managed to swallow it. Typical Jim, even now, when he was weak and nearing the end, he couldn't see me as anything but a disappointment. "So, that's it?" I asked, forcing my voice to stay steady. "He just decided I'm out." Chad looked away, clearly uncomfortable. "He thinks it's for the best, Alex. He never really understood you. You know that." For a moment, I wanted to get up and leave, to storm out and let them have the perfect little family moment without me. But something kept me rooted in my seat. I knew that if I left, it would only prove to them that I didn't care, that I didn't belong. So I stayed, though every minute felt like a test of my patience and pride. In the days that followed, Jim's condition worsened. The hospital visits became less about family bonding and more about waiting for the inevitable. Chad and Andy handled most of the arrangements, coordinating with doctors and talking to the legal team handling the will. I tried to stay out of the way, aware of how excluded I was from all of it. Every interaction, every glance, reminded me that in their eyes, I was still the outsider, the one who didn't belong. One evening, I arrived at the hospital, feeling the weight of it all settle heavily on my shoulders. It was clear that I was here out of a sense of duty rather than family love. But even though I didn't feel like I belonged, something kept pulling me back, making me show up day after day. When I arrived at the hospital, Chad and Andy were deep in conversation in the hallway. They stopped when they saw me, exchanging a glance before Chad motioned for me to join them. "We need to talk about the house," Chad said, sounding tense. I frowned, not quite understanding. "The house? Dad's decided to leave it to Andy," Chad explained, "along with some other assets." The news hit me like a punch in the gut. The house, where we'd all grown up, where memories both good and bad lived, was going to Andy without a second thought. It felt like another rejection, a reminder that I wasn't truly part of the family's picture. "But I started, but Andy cut me off with that patronizing tone I'd grown to hate. "Look, Alex," he said, "it's nothing personal. It's just practical. I'm the one who's been here, taking care of Dad, dealing with all the paperwork. You haven't exactly been around." I clenched my fists, barely able to keep my anger in check. "I haven't been around because Dad pushed me away," I shot back. "He never gave me a chance." Chad sighed, looking uncomfortable. "This isn't about taking sides, Alex. It's about making sure everything's in order according to Dad's wishes." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They were so absorbed in their own sense of duty, so focused on fulfilling Dad's wishes, that they couldn't see how deeply unfair this all was. Over the next few days, I tried to keep my distance, but the resentment only grew. It was clear how Dad's favoritism had twisted everything, turning Chad and Andy into rivals for his approval, almost as if his love was something they still had to earn, even in his final days. Finally, one night, I couldn't hold back any longer. I waited until Chad and Andy had left the hospital and then sat by Dad's bedside, feeling a confusing mix of anger and sadness. "Why did you leave me out?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He looked at me, his expression cold and unmoved. "You wouldn't understand, Alex. You've always been different. You never followed the path I laid out for you." "But I'm still your son," I replied, a knot of frustration building in my chest. "Why couldn't you just accept me?" He didn't answer. He simply turned away, as if my presence was too much to bear. Not long after that, I was scraping by, living paycheck to paycheck, barely managing on temp jobs. I'd put distance between myself and my family, but there were still days I felt the sting of everything they'd done, a shadow I couldn't quite escape. Then, one day, I got a phone call that would change everything. The call was from a lawyer's office, someone named Samuel Porter. I didn't recognize the name and almost didn't answer, assuming it was just another spam call. But when I did, I learned something that seemed impossible. I had inherited $10 million from a relative I'd never even known. I wasn't sure I believed it at first. News like that doesn't happen to someone like me. But as Samuel Porter spoke, laying out the details, it began to sink in. It was real. Something made me answer the call, and it was a good thing I did. "Is this Alex?" the man asked, his voice formal but with a hint of something almost excited. Yes, this is Alex," I replied, trying not to sound too curious. He introduced himself as Samuel Porter, representing the estate of my Aunt Martha. I barely knew Aunt Martha. She was my dad's sister, a quiet, eccentric woman I'd met a handful of times as a kid. She'd always kept to herself, and I'd had no idea she'd even thought about me over the years, let alone been keeping tabs from afar. "Mr. Porter," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "why are you calling me?" "Well, Alex," he said, pausing as if to let the news sink in, "your Aunt Martha passed away recently. And as it turns out, she left her entire estate to you." I almost dropped the phone. "Her entire estate?" I echoed, feeling like I'd been yanked out of reality and into someone else's dream. Mr. Porter continued, explaining that Aunt Martha had left me $10 million. The words felt surreal, like they weren't meant for me. Me, the unwanted strange kid who'd been pushed out of his own family. I hadn't even spoken to Aunt Martha in years. Why would she leave me everything? After a long pause, Mr. Porter added, "I understand if this is overwhelming, Alex. In fact, there are several details we need to go over. I'd like to meet with you in person if that's possible. I can walk you through the terms of the inheritance and answer any questions you have." I barely managed a stunned, "Okay." He set up a meeting, and when we hung up, I just sat there, staring at the wall. This money could change everything. I'd spent my life feeling belittled, made to feel small, always wishing I could escape and build a life where I didn't feel like a failure. And now, out of nowhere, here was my chance. But along with the shock and excitement came something else, a strange sense of confusion and even guilt. I kept asking myself, why me? Aunt Martha had other nieces and nephews, children of my dad's other siblings who had stayed close to her, who hadn't been estranged from the family. Why hadn't she chosen one of them? The day of the meeting finally arrived, and I walked into Mr. Porter's office still feeling half-dazed. He was a polished, middle-aged man with a crisp suit and a calm, professional smile. He welcomed me and gestured to a seat, launching into the details of the inheritance as I listened, trying to keep up. Aunt Martha's estate came with no strings attached. It was all mine, no requirements, no stipulations. And as I sat there, listening, it began to sink in that this inheritance wasn't just money. It was a way out, a fresh start. The inheritance came with no strings attached, no clauses, no conditions, nothing. Aunt Martha had simply chosen to leave it all to me, trusting I'd make something good of it. As we finished up the paperwork, Mr. Porter handed me a folded and sealed letter. "She left this for you," he said gently, his voice soft. "I think it might explain some things." My hands shook as I took the letter from him, and I waited until I was alone later that day to open it. Aunt Martha's letter was brief, her neat, deliberate handwriting filling the page with carefully chosen words. She wrote about how she'd watched me struggle over the years, seen how I'd been treated as an outsider in my own family. She'd seen the favoritism, the way Jim had pushed me aside, and she admitted she felt a deep sadness that she hadn't stepped in sooner. "I know how hard it is to feel unwanted in your own family, Alex," she wrote. "I was once in the same position, and it almost broke me. You deserved better than what you got. This inheritance is my way of giving you the chance I never had." I could barely believe it. Aunt Martha had understood me in a way no one else in my family ever had. All those years when I thought I was completely alone, someone had been watching, caring, even loving me from afar. For the first time in my life, I felt truly seen. It didn't take long for news of the inheritance to spread. Somehow, within days, everyone seemed to know. My phone began lighting up with messages from people I hadn't spoken to in years. Cousins I barely remembered, distant relatives suddenly eager to catch up, even old family friends pretending they'd always thought fondly of me. The most surprising call of all, though, came from my mom. "Alex, honey," she said, her voice unusually sweet. "How are you? It's been so long." I could hear the forced warmth, the barely concealed excitement in her tone. It was clear she'd heard about the money. When I didn't answer right away, she cleared her throat and tried again. "I heard about Aunt Martha's passing. Such a shame. She was always so generous." There was a hint of expectation in her voice that made my stomach turn. After all those years of ignoring me, of letting Jim treat me like a nuisance, she now wanted to play the role of a caring mother? I cut her off before she could say more. "What do you want, Mom?" I asked, my voice colder than I intended. But I didn't regret it. There was a pause on the other end, then a forced laugh. "What?" "Alex, I don't want anything. I just thought maybe we could talk. Reconnect, you know. As a family." The word family stung. Where was this family when I actually needed them? But she didn't give up easily. Over the next few days, the calls kept coming. My mom called again, as did Jim, who'd barely acknowledged me as his son, and even Chad, reaching out with thinly veiled friendliness. I realized then that the inheritance had done something unexpected. It had given me the upper hand. Jim's last message was short and clipped, with none of the fake warmth he used on others. It was just his raw, frustrated voice. "Alex, you're making a mistake. Family is family, and you can't just throw us away. You'll regret this." But I knew better. Family wasn't about blood. It was about loyalty, love, and respect, qualities they'd never shown me. As I hung up and deleted the voicemail, I felt a weight lift from my chest. For the first time, I felt free, truly free. With Aunt Martha's gift, I was finally building a life on my own terms. I bought a small place in a city far enough away to have the peace I'd always wanted, and I invested in an art studio, something I dreamed of but never thought possible. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving. I was creating, pouring myself into work that felt meaningful, where I didn't have to look over my shoulder or brace for the next jab. My younger brother, Andy, was the only one who seemed genuinely happy for me. When he called, his voice was full of excitement. "Alex, dude, that's amazing. I can't believe Aunt Martha left you all that." He didn't ask for anything, didn't hint around for a share. He was simply happy for me, with no strings attached. For once, I felt like someone in my family was proud of me without any ulterior motives. But as the weeks went by, my other family members kept reaching out. My mom left voicemails, her tone filled with forced nostalgia as she tried to guilt-trip me, reminiscing about my difficult teenage years and how she'd done her best. She wanted a chance to rebuild our relationship, as if a few words could erase years of neglect. Even Lacey reached out, claiming she'd always admired me, though it was clear she, too, saw me as a potential safety net. I eventually changed my number, cutting them off completely. I didn't owe them anything, and I didn't need them complicating this new chapter in my life. Aunt Martha's gift had given me a fresh start, a chance to live without their shadow hanging over me. I carried her memory with me, knowing that she'd believed in me when no one else had. Aunt Martha had given me the life I'd been dreaming of, and I wasn't about to waste it chasing approval from people who'd only ever seen me as a disappointment or a convenience. I was finally free, and this time, I wasn't looking back. It was time to start living for myself, to honor Aunt Martha's gift by building a life that was truly my own. I knew my family would likely have something to say about the inheritance, but I didn't expect just how ugly it would get. It started with phone calls and messages, first a few, here and there. Mom left a voicemail, sounding casual, almost friendly. "Hi, Alex, it's been a while, hasn't it? Just wanted to catch up. We should grab lunch sometime." Growing up, Mom was never the warm, nurturing type. Her calls were usually brief, more out of obligation than interest. So why this sudden urge to reconnect? I ignored it. But then she called again, this time dropping the pretense. "Alex, honey, we need to talk. I know you're doing well now, thanks to Aunt Martha's generosity. I just think it would be fair if you'd consider helping your family, too. After all, without me, you wouldn't even have known Aunt Martha." I let out a bitter laugh. She'd barely spoken to Aunt Martha herself, let alone introduced me. Growing up, I'd thought of Aunt Martha as the eccentric, distant relative Mom had nearly forgotten. Now, here she was, acting like she'd been Aunt Martha's closest confidant. When I didn't respond, Mom escalated. One day, she showed up at my apartment unannounced. I opened the door, surprised and definitely not thrilled to see her standing there with a forced smile. "Alex, I was in the neighborhood, thought I'd stop by." She brushed past me, letting herself in without an invitation, her eyes roaming over my apartment with that critical look she'd always had. "Nice place you have here," she said, sounding anything but impressed. "Looks like you're doing well for yourself." I could feel the tension building. "Mom, what's this really about?" The forced smile dropped, and her tone turned sharp. "Look, Alex, let's not play games. This money, it's not just yours. It belongs to the family. We all deserve a part of it. I've done so much for you, sacrificed more than you'll ever know. $1 million would make things right. It's only fair." "Fair," I repeated, a familiar frustration rising in me. "You think you're entitled to Aunt Martha's money? She left it to me for a reason, Mom. She didn't give it to you." Her expression hardened, and she crossed her arms. "Oh, so that's how it is. After everything I did, raising you, dealing with your strangeness, you're going to turn your back on me?" I shook my head, struggling to keep my voice steady. "You and I both know you didn't support me, Mom. You let Jim push me around, ignored me when I needed you, and treated me like an outsider for years." Her face tightened. "I sacrificed for you, Alex. I did what I had to do. And now that you have the chance, you owe us." "I don't owe you anything," I said quietly, finally finding the strength to say the words out loud. She glared at me, the resentment plain in her eyes. Without another word, she left, slamming the door behind her. It was a moment I dreaded but also needed. Aunt Martha's inheritance had given me the freedom to cut these strings once and for all. And as the weeks went by, the calls from other family members continued, but I didn't answer. I even changed my number to finally give myself the distance I deserved. The last message came from Jim. His voice was sharp and cold, free of any attempt at charm. "Alex, you're making a mistake. Family is family, and you can't just throw us away. You'll regret this." But I knew better now. Family wasn't about blood, it was about loyalty, respect, and love. And those were things they had never shown me. As I deleted the voicemail, I felt a weight lift from my chest. Aunt Martha had given me the chance to finally live life on my own terms, and I wasn't going to waste it trying to mend fences with people who'd never seen me as anything but an inconvenience. Jim made it clear how he felt about me, and now that I have money, suddenly I'm worth something to you. Mom's face twisted with anger. "Fine," she spat, grabbing her purse. "But don't be surprised if this doesn't end here. I'll see you in court if I have to. You owe me, Alex." With that, she stormed out, slamming the door so hard the walls shook. A few days later, I received an official notice in the mail. Mom and Jim were suing me, claiming they were entitled to a portion of Aunt Martha's inheritance. They'd hired some cut-rate lawyer named Vincent Crane, who had a reputation for taking on clients desperate to make a quick grab at someone else's fortune. The audacity of it all was infuriating, but I knew I couldn't afford to ignore it. I called Sam Porter, my lawyer, the same man who'd helped me navigate Aunt Martha's estate. Sam was calm, unfazed, and experienced. "Don't worry, Alex," he said confidently. "I've seen stunts like this before. Legally, they don't have a leg to stand on. Aunt Martha's will is rock solid." After reviewing the case documents, he found Crane's arguments were flimsy, relying on emotional manipulation and vague claims rather than any concrete legal grounds. Within days, Sam had gathered enough evidence to get their case dismissed before it even began. But that didn't stop them. As soon as they realized the courts wouldn't give them what they wanted, Mom and Jim started calling again, switching tactics. This time, Jim left a voicemail, his tone dripping with feigned sympathy. "Alex, we're family. This isn't how it's supposed to be. Family sticks together. You should be looking out for us, for your brothers and sister. You're being selfish." The hypocrisy nearly made me laugh. I ignored it, but the messages kept coming, more relentless than ever. Finally, I blocked their numbers, hoping they'd take the hint. But they weren't done with me yet. One evening, I got a call from Andy. My heart sank when I saw his name flash on my screen. Andy was the only one in the family I still had some connection to, the only one who hadn't treated me like an outsider. I thought he understood what I'd gone through, but from the moment he spoke, I knew something was wrong. "Alex," he began, his tone hesitant, "Mom and Jim, they're really upset. They keep saying you've abandoned us. Maybe you could, I don't know, maybe just give them a little, just enough to keep the peace." Hearing those words from Andy felt like a punch to the gut. I thought he understood. I thought he'd seen how they'd treated me all these years. But here he was, joining in, trying to push me to give in. "Andy," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady, "this isn't about keeping the peace. They're trying to use me. Aunt Martha left me this inheritance because she knew exactly what they were like. They don't care about me, they care about what I can give them." Andy was silent for a long moment. Finally, he sighed. I hate seeing the family like this, Alex. It feels like everything's falling apart." I let out a deep breath, the weight of years of frustration and betrayal pressing down on me. "Andy, it was already broken," I said, my voice thick with pain. "I'm just finally done pretending it wasn't." There was another long pause. Then, quietly, he said, "Take care, Alex," and hung up. I stared at the phone in my hand, feeling the last shred of connection to my family slip away. But with that loss came a strange sense of clarity. Aunt Martha had left me this inheritance to break free of the past, to finally build a life that wasn't weighed down by guilt and manipulation. I wouldn't let them take that away from me. The next day, I blocked Andy's number, too. It wasn't easy, but I knew it was the only way to protect myself. For the first time, I felt like I was finally in control of my life, free from the chains that had held me back for so long. And I wasn't going to let anyone drag me down again. "Broken, Andy." "It's been broken for years," I said, my voice laced with a finality that even surprised me. That call was my tipping point. I was done with the guilt trips, the manipulation, the endless ways they tried to make me feel like I owed them something. Aunt Martha's inheritance was mine, a gift to free me from the past, and I wasn't going to let them taint it. I cut off all contact, blocked their numbers, and when Mom and Jim started showing up at my place, demanding their fair share, I took the final step. I filed a restraining order. It felt strange, severe even, but necessary. For the first time in my life, I felt untouchable. No more threats, no more unsolicited visits. I was truly free. With that newfound freedom, I decided to build something real, something for myself. I hired a financial advisor, Sarah, a quiet, sharp-witted woman who, unlike my family, was interested in seeing me succeed on my terms. With her guidance, I invested Aunt Martha's money with intention and care. I put money into a local art studio, created a scholarship fund for kids from troubled backgrounds, and supported small businesses owned by friends who'd been there for me without ever asking for a single thing in return. Each choice, each investment, felt like a declaration. I was finally building a life that mattered, not because of my family's demands or approval, but because it was mine. And with each new step, I felt myself becoming the person Aunt Martha must have seen in me, a person with potential, with integrity, and, for once, with real, unshakable control over his own future.